Like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight, we are doing an epic podcast, one that's more thorough than we have done in quite some time. Tonight's podcast will be on the fairies, or the little people, depending on where you're from. Don't assume that to mean that it's just going to be, you know, the little funny men in the woods and stuff like that. This is actually going to be pretty dark. It covers missing time, people, murders, creatures that can actually twist and turn the forest to confuse the people around them, take them into different dimensions, all kinds of superstitious beliefs, linking them to devils and demons, demons and angels. So yeah, it's going to be a really thorough and big topic. I expect this is actually going to be 2 parts, which brings me to some of the things that we're doing. Just a quick little note that we got to run through for our regulars here. So this is going to be divided into 2 parts. Part 1, going to be free with the ads. Part 2 is going to be, it's going to be paid $1. And from here on out, what we're going to be doing is timed exclusives, which is to say, if you're willing to wait a couple months, it will eventually go free. But originally, they are going to be $1 for the first couple months at least, and they will be looked at on a episode basis, individually. We've put up our paid episodes, and honestly, they're doing really good. We've got like 48 free videos out there. You can literally binge watch them for weeks. An hour a day. You can go for over a month. Anyone who's watching or who have watched our stuff know what we're all about. You know what we're going to bring, and we want to do some more of these really big epic things. It takes some time to do it. That's just it's what works best for us. One of the other things you'll notice is that we've disabled the comments on our channel. We're not the first or the last people that have and will do this. There's many channels and complete websites, popular news websites and media channels that have done this because nobody can deal with the trolls. There's just no way to deal with them. And frankly, going on and looking at the comments, I could be in the best of moods, and these personal attacks just take me out of it. I don't want to do this anymore, and it just ruins everything for everybody. So we're not going to have comments. If you do want to comment, though, you can go onto the official website. You can comment there until that becomes a problem. Hopefully it won't, but if it do, I'll just remove it there as well. I just can't put up with it. And for the rest of you that have commented, that I had wanted to get back to, I just can't look at those comments anymore. So sorry, no replies. You can get at us from the website. Neither Ryan or I want to deal with the trolls anymore. There's actually been a study, it's like 6% of all YouTube comments are personal attacks, and it's just not worth it. It ruins the whole atmosphere for us.
Likewise, you can always contact us via our email as well.
Yes. So that will be the primary way, and again, you can communicate via comments on the official website, but that's it. No more YouTube stuff. So with that said, getting into the topic of the evil little fairies. Okay, so the first things first. What are fairies? Because everybody kind of has a preconceived notion of what these beings are. So modern TV, especially kids shows, they always have these fairy-like creatures on there. Children's plays, stories, books, they would have you believe that fairies are these happy little green men, playful and kind, but in reality, a fairy is known to be mischievous, a trickster, evil, and they command strange powers. Though there are certainly stories of fairies helping and even saving people, those stories are typically far and few in between. Fairies are also known, as I mentioned earlier, the little people of the forest. They're also to fall under such names as the little folk, the fair folk, the people of peace, and they get their gentle little names mainly to avoid insulting them. That's a little interesting note. These are not kind names because that's what people think of them, but they don't want to insult them.
I've also heard people of the hills.
Yep, because they claim certain little hills and stuff like that. That's something we'll get into. One thing that you'll find when reading up on fairy lore is that to cross a fairy usually means dire consequences or even death. Now, some of the powers fairies are said to command, just to give you an idea of what these things are all about, they are able to bestow continual good fortune and or continual bad luck. They command the power of illusion. They can make people see things that aren't there, such as transforming the forest and the land all around the people. And they can hide things that they do not wish them to see, often themselves. They can become invisible. Whether it is an illusion or an actual talent, that are, at least to us, our perceived perception of them is that they can shapeshift, not unlike what they say of the skinwalkers. I mean, the fairies are known to shapeshift. They are said to often mislead people or lure them into traps using these methods, making hazardous places appear safe. Like say it's a dangerous grotto or cliff, they can make it look as if it's safe, and they lure them there with music. They call to them. Perhaps I don't know why they do it, but maybe they find it fun. Maybe that's the definition of being evil. They find the stuff fun. And, for them, and you'll see throughout all these different stories, I mean, this is an ongoing thing. And there's even like old, like you'll see when we get into the will-o'-the-wisp and jack-o'-lanterns and stuff like that. I mean, these things are often used to lure people into dangerous grounds. And some people are injured or killed. They've also been said to have the ability. I did mention shapeshift, but it's not just animals like what they say with the skinwalkers. A fairy can apparently shapeshift into an animal or even a piece of the forest, such as a tree or a log or a rock. Fairies are also said to be able to control the weather. Again, like these are creatures that can, they command nature. They can also cause illness, influence fertility with crops and animals, and cause what's termed as a fairy stroke, which can injure or cause death. And yes, they can actually still cure the sick. So these are, they have the ability to be good. It's just mostly that's not the stories we hear. So let's go into their origins a little bit. Where does all this stuff come from? Where do they come from? Well, the origins are pretty interesting, actually. Some believe that the fairies are actually fallen angels who, instead of following Satan into hell, stayed here on earth. Some variations of that theory say that they were the weaker demons And the stronger demons actually forced them to stay here because they weren't considered strong or powerful enough to take fight alongside them in the spiritual war. Another explained the fairies as a dead folk, just regular Joes like us, who were not good enough for heaven, but not bad enough for hell. So they were stuck here in limbo. And finally, some believe they are children of Eve, children that she hid because they were quote unquote dirty. Because Eve hid them, God cursed her and them because of her deception. So the curse meant that her children would always be hidden from her and mankind. So the stories that I've read seem to point to the first option, which is to say, I believe that if either of those theories are correct, I believe that it would most likely be the fallen angel stuck here on Earth. While researching this topic, I've come across many interesting details regarding the locals that are entrenched with fairy lore. One is that, they are typically small communities who are very religious and superstitious. The second is that while they have many different ways to ward off fairies, one of the most effective seems to be using religious symbols and the Bible itself. And that's, again, like these little tidbits that point or kind of tie the fallen angel theory together. For example, I read that in the smaller areas in Newfoundland, which, by the way, a big source of my research for this was a book by a Newfoundland author called named Dale Jarvis. Yeah, he had some really, really interesting things on the fairies in Newfoundland. Anyway, apparently the mothers in Newfoundland would often sew pages of the Bible into the insides of their children's jackets. So if they were being chased by a fairy, these kids could even turn their jackets inside out to disappear, at least in terms of the fairy, or it could scare them off, right?
I find it interesting. Of course, now I read a lot of the same origin tales of the fairy, and I mean, of course, whenever you read these kinds of things, we are all well aware that most of these areas, I mean, we're talking, Ireland and Scotland and
I,
all over England as well, that, these beliefs were well entrenched long before Christianity ever, was known, or in some cases, some tales say that, the fairy stories, I'm trying to avoid saying fairy tales, fairy stories go back, even before the advent of Christianity as an actual religion. But I'm also forced to kind of think of the similarities that there exist between the origin stories of the fairy and also the origin story of the jinn, which is a creature from Islamic mythology. And it's very interesting that both entities, while they're not really talked about as being the same kind of creatures, here we have two completely separate cultures describing a creature, or describing the origins of a creature that are very similar. These in between beings. They're not men. They're not angels. They're not demons. They're this in between creature.
yeah,
I always find it interesting to draw the parallels.
well, yeah, and like once we get farther into this, I do have some story. Like usually when you read up on this stuff, I mean, the most dominant place within regards to fairies is probably Ireland. Newfoundland was surprisingly rich with it too, and then you have Britain. But this is not exclusive to us. This is also, I've read stories of Native Indians who had their own theories and stuff like that, and an experience with the fairies. So it all does. It has a wide spectrum from different cultures, and as you said, I totally believe that it goes, it goes back before Christianity. However, that being said, there are some parallelisms between, I guess, you know, you could say the behavior of them, but I think more so, I think the interesting part is that when people say, you know, they're dealing with a demon or they're doing exorcisms or stuff like that, they have religious either scripture or items that they use that apparently works. I wouldn't know because I haven't, you know, personally had to deal with it. But just to go back on some of the things, like, now this is the communities that have you know, been brought up with the fairies. It was very prominent in their culture, and particularly in Newfoundland, where this book that I read. So they had houses there that would have Bibles and crucifixes, for example, surrounding the frames of all of the windows and doors on the inside of the house. So, I mean, this is like a protective barrier that would prevent the little people from piercing the threshold of their home. Some other non-related fairy wards, just for to bring it up, is that it can be anything made of iron. They say that fairies, despite being master metal workers, consider iron working to be something only humans can do and to be strange and unsettling to them. The most popular iron ward, therefore, tended to be horseshoes. Horseshoes, aside from the fact that they usually are iron, are also considered lucky. So some folk would actually, you know, they hang them either above the door with the pointed ends pointed up, and they say that in this way the luck doesn't run out. And other people believe that the ends have to be pointed down so that when you walk through the threshold, the luck pours over you. But either way, it's considered lucky, and it's made of iron. And this is one of the artifacts, or not artifacts, but one of the items that people often use to stop the fairies from getting access to their home. So that's one thing. But again, like, we have the people with the religious artifacts. So you have the religious scripture, such as the mothers that would sew that into the lining of their children's jackets. And, you know, people would use Bibles again in around the windows and doors. But another thing that they don't have, and like, I'm telling you guys this because I want you to recall this later when I tell some of these stories. Another thing that the little people apparently can't do is cross running water. So we have religious items, we have iron, and running water. These are things that the fairies supposedly cannot pierce. They cannot cross the threshold of these items. So,
and I guess again, that's, you know, that's in certain specific fairy mythologies.
yes,
Because of course, there's all kinds of stories of water fairies and waterfall fairies and fairy pools, and which, again, would directly so again, we're looking at a specific probably regional mythology.
Yeah, we're generally most of this stuff is coming from Ireland and Newfoundland. I mean, that because even like in Newfoundland, where apparently that Newfoundland got the fairy culture from was people from Ireland who immigrated over.
Yeah,
and
well, Newfoundland was heavily settled by, it was the English and mostly the Irish. A little bit of Scottish, but mostly Irish and English.
Yeah, so I mean, they brought their culture and beliefs with them. So, speaking of the communities who grew up with the fairies, because of their fear, I mean, they really treated this like you or I would treat the weather. It's cold out, we're gonna dress up. Except, in this case, it wasn't really necessarily physical and definitely there, but they believed it. And so the communities who grew up with the fairies often created safe havens out of their homes. And they did that with the Bibles and the horseshoes around the windows and the door frames. They'd hang the horseshoes over the door. They would sew the Bible passages in their kid's jacket. And another thing is that because, they were so involved with this culture, it was brought up all the time. There was events that happened frequently enough that, the people who lived there would know enough to avoid certain marshes, hills, and other land masses that were known to belong to the fairies. and they would make note of any bridge that would cross water, because if it just so happened, like if they had been out in the woods that day and they just happened to get chased by a fairy or followed by a fairy and they needed to get away, well, that bridge wasn't out. So they made note of where these things were, and how, just as you or I would probably look at the floor plan of a building in case there was a fire, right? Where's your quickest exit? And that's kind of the way that they looked at the bridges. And
It was a very matter of fact part of their life.
it was. It wasn't like just a superstition. Like they lived their lives in fear that they could run into these things. So and lastly, as an extra safety precaution, you've probably heard this, but those who had to go through the woods would often carry breadcrumbs in their pockets, and they carried this as a peace offering. In case they ran into the fairies, they might exchange these breadcrumbs in exchange for their lives, right? So as you can see, many small communities, particularly from Ireland and Newfoundland, have been so affected by the fairies that they have inconveniently built their lives around avoiding their wrath. This isn't all down to superstition, but rather this is down to the scary and sometimes tragic stories, some of which we're going to tell. But they've had these kinds of stories running in their community and told by their family for well over 100 years. So this is, again, like they grew up believing in this 100%. So with, the little bit on what the fairies are and what they're all about, let's go to our first story. Okay, so this happened in Newfoundland in a little place called Witless Bay. Okay, so one thing that people don't really know about little people of the forest is that they can claim certain marshes, little hills, and patches of heather. And if you don't know what heather is, it's basically little shrubs with purple flowers. Anyway, people who grew up with the folklore of the little people are often told of certain marshes or areas in the forest to avoid because, bad mamma jamma if you go in there with the fairies. So again, like this isn't just because of superstition, but often because bad things have happened to some of the folks in their community who just happen to wander into these places, and they just happen to be able to live and tell about it. Now, most people know of these stories from the Irish, but many Irish came to Newfoundland. They took their stories and beliefs with them. In fact, quite a few people I spoke to who have been to both Newfoundland and Ireland say that the land and views are almost identical. If you go to Newfoundland, you go to Ireland, if you didn't know any better, you'd probably say you're in the same place. Now, typically encounters with the fairies happen in small forested areas. And if you've never been to Newfoundland, let me just tell you that this place is just absolutely full of little towns and forests and that kind of habitat. I mean, you can drive the highway for miles and miles and miles, and you'll be passing these little tiny towns and forests. It's all forest the whole way, but there's tons of these little tiny towns in the forest and on the coast and just all over the place. So,
And also, if you fly over the island, I know the first time I flew over, I was absolutely blown away by the amount of marshes,
yes,
and
yes.
wetlands, which again is another popular habitat of the fairy folk.
And if for you regulars, you've probably heard where Ryan and I told a story, and Ryan had a story where he was in a bog and he had missing time. Now, he didn't mention fairies, but it's worth going to listen to after you hear this podcast if you haven't heard it, just for the to look at it in hindsight of the particulars and how some of it relates to what we're going to tell in these stories. So anyway, this particular story happened in a small town, like I said, called Witless Bay. So there's this young man, and he was on his way home from seeing his girlfriend. Now, this was like I believe it was the 40s, so parents were really strict back then. And he's late, it's late. He doesn't want to upset his mother by being too late, probably because she'd smack his ass apart, right? So on his way home, he decides to, jot across this marsh. Now, this marsh was generally avoided by the locals because it was said to have been owned by the fairies. Now, the younger guy, just like what we would probably do, chalks it all up to being superstitious bullshit. And he decides to cross anyway because it's a shortcut. He's going to save time, and maybe his mom won't beat him to death. So, because the shortcut goes directly through kind of towards his house. If he followed the path, it literally circles this marsh like kilometers. Okay, like it's really really out of the way. So anyway, he starts running across this marsh, and a really interesting thing happened. As soon as he starts getting in there, the normal sounds that were previously accompanying him, such as the whistling wind and the crickets and stuff like that, it all seemed to die down. He's like he walked into a bubble. There was no more sounds of crickets. The sounds of animals disappeared. The air was stilled, and it got darker, seemingly darker, as if the clouds had moved underneath the moon. So it's like he went into this bubble. And at some point, he found this mound. It was like a little hill. And he decided to, climb up on top of it to get a better view of the land and just to ensure that, he was heading in the right direction towards his house. It was at that time, when he was up on top of the mound, that he felt a hot stabbing pain in the back of his leg. In the book, and this was Dale Jarvis's book, what is it called? It is called Wonderful Strange, I think it's called. Anyway, he was up there. He feels a stabbing pain in the back of his leg, and he said it felt as if like someone had taken a hot fire poker and just jammed it in the back of his leg. I mean, he collapsed. He crumples to the ground, and then he pulls himself up somewhat, and he reaches back with his hand, to feel what is this thing that just went through my leg, expecting to feel something physical, and there's nothing there. He puts his hand on his leg. There's absolutely nothing there. And this, scared the shit out of him. But immediately he thought, fairy arrow. Like, he knew he got shot by a fairy arrow. So then he picks himself up. He's in agony. He's in intense pain. He's grabbing the back of his leg. And he's freaked out. He's trembling. And he starts limping home. He starts limping home like his ass is on fire. He's really freaked out, especially because he kind of knows what happened to him. All the superstitious stuff that he heard growing up is all of a sudden true. So he manages to limp home, and he's in a panic. He calls out to his parents just before collapsing, and this, by the way, is called a daybed. They had it in their kitchen. It's not something that you or I are really familiar with, but back then they had these things called daybeds that they would keep in places like that. Anyway, he collapses on this thing after he calls out to his parents. And once his parents came to his aid, they could tell, there was something serious going on. It wasn't just, something small. It wasn't too long, that evening before there was a gathering of his family around the bed. His leg was swelling badly. So his mother made him a poultice, which is is a soft, moist material, usually some kind of plant, which is used to reduce swelling. Okay. So none of this eased his pain whatsoever, didn't help with the swelling. And to make matters worse, he started developing a temperature. And this only got higher and higher throughout the night. So by the morning, he was looking pretty grim, and, the swelling had gotten to the point that it was actually hard to the touch, right? And finally, this is a small town after all. The word had gotten out to the neighbors and spread across the small town with Struan, this healer of sorts. Now, he didn't have any official medical training or anything, but he was known to the folks in the town as a do-it-yourself healer, I guess you could call it. So this healer shows up. He assessed the young man, and he asks, for some bowls of hot water and towels and a knife from the family. The healer, he gets the bowls of water and the rags and stuff, and he washed the young man's leg, and then he took the knife, and he began to cut where the swelling was. The circle of people that were, around this bed at the time, they were shocked at what they witnessed. In fact, as soon as the mother saw it, she fell to her knees and started praying loudly, just at the sight of this. As the healer cut open the leg It wasn't blood and pus that came out. Of course, there was blood, but that wasn't the thing that got everybody. What got people was that moss, sand, tiny bones, and fur was coming out of it. It was packed in there, so that was what was making his legs swollen so tight. This mix was so tightly packed into his leg, and it was coming out all compressed and little bits of stuff. And, after the strange elements were removed, the healer cleaned his leg and sewed up the wound, and then, all this, the debris, we'll call it, was removed, and the towels that were soaked in blood, all this stuff was thrown into a wood stove. And as it burned, it was said by the people who were gathered there that they could hear an ominous hiss coming from the fire. And what happened to this young man was considered a warning. Some folks who are lucky enough to get away with a warning, that's what happens. They still go through a traumatic experience, but they live to tell the tale. So for this guy,
And what was the time frame of the story? Like what?
I'm pretty sure it was the 1940s or 50s.
Okay.
Right? And so after all was said and done, the man was technically healed, but from what they say is that this man had a limp for as long as he lived. So, I find it pretty ominous, actually. I mean, the amazing part was that, first of all, he gets struck with something that has no physical, he doesn't actually have a physical arrow in his leg or whatever. And he had went to a place that he was told was a fairy claimed place, which he wasn't supposed to do. And then they find these weird little things in there that are associated with fairies and people who have run-ins like this. And it was all packed in his leg. And for all we know, this probably could have kept building in a system until it killed him. So, this stuff came out, and I found it interesting that, when they threw it into the wood fire, whether it's true or not, they hear this ominous hiss, as it's burning, as if it was evil. And it was whatever evil was attached to this debris was being cleansed in the fire. And so, if you guys listening have never been to Newfoundland or Ireland and you plan to visit, it might be worth reading up a little on the local folklore before blindly heading into the forest. So you'll hear if you do a little research, you'll hear a lot of stories like that. But I have another one there, unless, Ryan, you want to speak a bit on what I just told.
Well, I guess this particular tale really underscores the mystery of the fairy. Of course, the time frame you're talking about, the 1950s, is not exactly an ancient story, and you would expect, at least to some degree, that people are a little less mythically minded in those days than they would say if the story came from the 1600s.
Small communities, though, really small, yeah. Right?
Oh, certainly small communities. So sometimes we think about, we hear these tales and we think, they're just misinterpreting things because it was, the 1800s or the 1700s, and they have all kinds of superstitions. But, even in a small community in the 1950s, people are a little more aware of the world around them. And, I find it difficult to believe that a group of people would, mistake, a pile of bones and fur and moss coming out of a guy's leg. Well, that's pretty significant.
And the irony, of course, is that the young lad didn't believe this. He thought it was superstitious bullshit, and that's what got him into it in the first place.
Indeed, So since the tale is a little more recent than most of the fairy stories that we tend to come across, from the Brothers Grimm or some ancient bit of folklore. This is a I guess we could call a recent or a relatively recent story of fairies, and I think it's quite a significant factor to take into account when you're talking about removing bones and moss and twigs and grass and sand and little bits of rock, out of somebody's leg. How you think how if you had that happen, and you knew that you didn't cut yourself and fall into a mess of sticks and moss and dirt, and then your leg healed over with all that junk in there. I mean, it was literally just like a day, there's no chance for anything foreign to enter this guy's body in that kind of a way. So, where did this stuff come from?
Yeah, well, that was just it, right? And the interesting thing with the stories in this book was that most of the stories regarding the fairies I found happened either in the, sometime in the 1900s or late 1800s. So I mean, we're not talking about really old, ancient lore that have been passed down for centuries. This somewhat is modern. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, some people have grandparents who are like centenarians, 100 years old. 100 years old, there's people alive today that old, and they were back, so that's only half their lives ago, the 50s, or no, it'd be the 60s. Anyway, you get what I'm trying to say. It's not that long ago.
It's not at all.
Right.
And there are the more modern fairy stories that you can find, and one in particular that always comes to my mind whenever somebody talks about the little people. I believe it's part of a documentary that a gentleman did from Nova Scotia, and because again, there's some strong fairy myths in Nova Scotia and that area. Pretty much the Maritimes. There is a pretty strong fairy lore tradition, and it's a great documentary. I can't remember the name of it at this moment, but this guy interviews a woman who had taken her children swimming, off in the forest, and she, looks over while her kids are swimming, and she sees a group of little people coming through the forest, and they're all like dancing and singing and twirling about, and she's just standing there in shock, staring at this group of little, fairy people. And I can't remember. I think they were like 2 feet tall or something like that. And all together, they just, she knew right away that they weren't people, that there was something wrong. There was something different about these, and she like, she's telling her kids, get in the car. And, they're hesitating. And finally she just, screams at them, get in the car, and, ushers them in. The kids don't really know why mom is freaking out. She just shoves them all in the vehicle, jumps behind the wheel, and starts speeding away. And, I believe it was like 2 younger kids, and she had an older daughter that was like 11 or 12 or something. And, the older, and she looked at her older daughter and said, like, don't look back, and of course, being a kid, you can't say that to a kid. She turns and looks back, and for the first time sees this group of little people, and they've had formed up, near where they were swimming into a circle, and were dancing and leaping about in this circle, and just from listening to them tell the story, it's such a unlikely tale. But listening to the inflection in their voices, they were very, very freaked out by the whole thing,
So it had a genuineness about it when.
Yeah, it definitely did. I mean, I don't know about everyone out there. But when I hear something that has a ring of truth to it, I get a certain sense, a certain feeling, and these people, because primarily I believe it was the mother and the daughter that were being interviewed, because the 2 other kids were young and didn't really see anything, and they even kind of reenact, I do believe, the the scene in a way. And I'm not 100% sure, but I do believe that they even went so far as, they took them back towards the area. I don't know if they went right to the spot, but they were, they went close to where they had the experience, and then kind of acted out what the little people were doing. So it was very, I believe the documentary was done in sometime in the 90s, early 90s or something. Um, so we're talking, modern era. So it's just, I found it very interesting to hear a story, I guess, about little people in the modern era from, what seemed to be perfectly normal, everyday people.
Well, I actually intend to go out and do some looking myself when I go on vacation. So
You better get a rock with a natural borehole in it.
yeah, I heard that. I heard that. Yeah, I'll probably take a couple little trinkets that will protect me, but I would hope to come back with at least witnessing something, even if it's not worth talking about in a podcast. Maybe just something that I'll find interesting. But I'd like to get to the next story, which, it features one of the really interesting things about fairies that aren't, it isn't often talked about. And what it is this anomaly regarding the encounters with the fairy and how they can apparently transform the forest to confuse and trap people. Now, there are certain rules locals from these kinds of parts generally follow. Again, like not to be redundant, but they avoid strange marshes, hills, and patches of heather. They try to stay away from the forest at night, and they avoid going out there when it's foggy. I mean, that sounds like, some of those things sound like common sense. But anyway, one thing that you'll find in a lot of these stories involving fairies is missing time. Many witness accounts, detail how they had been gone for several more hours than it felt. In fact, I mean, many stories will say something to the effect of being somewhere for what felt like 15 minutes, only to discover that 6 hours had passed. People have been known to go out and look for these missing people, knowing that they were close by, checking, common walking trails, marshes, or meetup spots in the woods, only to find nothing, no trace. Sometimes people go looking for their friends or loved ones, who had only been gone for 10 minutes, right? And when they go looking and calling out to them, they can't fathom how their friends or family can't hear them calling. How did it get so far away in 10 minutes that, they can't hear them screaming out to them? And, these people show up later and they don't understand how they were missing either. So some of these people that do go missing, they come back with some pretty strange tales. But one of the most interesting aspects to their tale is how they get lost in the first place. The first thing to understand is that almost all of the people that this happened to, they know their local forest like the back of their hand. They live there, they grow up there, and they're always on these walking trails. I mean, we're talking about small communities where these people grow up, using these walking trails just as you or I would, use the certain roads that we use to get to work, right? I mean, they know it so well, their whole lives they use these trails. I mean, in these small towns, sometimes these trails are as necessity as like shortcuts to the local market. They're so normal for these people to walk on. It's kind of baffling that they could get lost at all. I mean, these walking trails are generally pretty linear. So it's all the more baffling when these locals who know the forest so well get lost on these familiar trails, and they get lost for large quantities of time that goes unaccounted for. Stranger still is that some of these people claim to suddenly stumble into unknown forests, and that's where we're going to get into the fairy ability to transform the forest around the people in it. So let me clarify that a bit. with some of the details from the stories that I read. So there was this guy, okay, and he was in a local small Newfoundland town. He knew the forest like I said, like we know our way to work. And on a couple of separate occasions, so this wasn't once, this happened several times, okay? He got completely lost in areas he knew as well as you know your backyard. But how he described it is downright creepy. So, like on this one occasion, for example, he came across this rock, and the locals knew it there as Fairy Rock. Apparently all the fairies hung out there or whatever. Not that they could ever see it, but anyway, that was their belief. And he was walking in this area, and you know how like when you're walking sometimes you're looking straight ahead, but every now and then you're looking at the ground and you're kind of going back and forth. You're making sure you're not stepping on stuff. You're kind of keeping a view on where you're going. So you're going from the ground and up, from the ground and up, right? So he's walking and he's glancing up and down, and and this particular point, he's watching the ground, okay? This all happens within a short time, 10, 15 seconds in between up and down, right? So he's looking at the ground as he's walking. And then when he looks up, he said, it's as if the forest had completely transformed all around him. All the trees were different. They were unfamiliar. The colors were all wrong. It's as if the forest quickly and quietly grew around him to ensnare him. He looked, when he looked up, he was like crazy lost. I mean, it was as if it didn't even look like a forest in Newfoundland, we'll say. I mean, it just was completely different. It looked like a completely foreign area. And despite living there his whole life and being on this trail for like probably 1,000 times, I mean, it's as if someone just picked them up and dropped them in a third world country forest. I mean, that's the equivalent of what it sounded like. So in this panic, not knowing what to do, he just began quickly walking in the opposite direction in hopes that, he could walk the hell out of whatever he walked into. And at some point, I guess in his hustle and bustle, he lost his footing and he fell on his face. Well, when he got up and he looked around, he was right back where he had been before all this happened. All the strange trees and foreboding was gone. This, however, happened to him again. And, he's not the only person to have claimed that this had happened to them. So, going on that same story, we got the weird, transforming forest. But one of the stranger stories I heard in the forest involves a man and his son. This one's actually pretty creepy. So, they both go out into the woods with the purpose of cutting firewood. And at some point, the father was really alarmed to discover that his son was nowhere to be seen. Now, you can imagine, these guys know the forest. I mean, they're not out chopping firewood as a new activity. This is something they probably do all the time. And so he's not watching his kid constantly. I mean, his kid's around. He can hear him. He's playing, whatever. But he notices his kid isn't there. I guess it's unusual, and he gets a bit panicked. So it's getting a little bit dark, and I mean, they don't want to be in the woods when it's dark anyway. So he starts calling out to his son, and he hears this voice. And the voice says, "I'm over here." So, the father would, walk towards or jog towards this voice, and, he wouldn't find him. So he'd call out again, and, this time the voice would be a little further in the woods and it would say, "I'm over here." So this apparently had gone on for about an hour. It was like playing with him. And the father kept going deeper and deeper into the woods, chasing this voice. And because of how dark it was rapidly getting, and his inability to find his son over the course of this hour, the father, out of fear and desperation, he gave up. He ran home with the intent to call the police for help and to find his son. So it was when he got home that he discovered his son. He was already there. He was sitting there at the kitchen table. And he was stunned. He asked his son, what the hell? How did you get home? And apparently hours earlier, his son had actually ran into an older gentleman picking berries, and he took him home. As frightening as it may sound to have a stranger take your kid home.
Stranger find your kid in the woods.
Yeah, but again, we're talking small communities where everybody knows everybody, so it's not as strange as it sounds for you folks in the big city. So anyway, the question is, what was it that was calling out to the father in the woods, and more importantly, what was it going to do to him? Where was it bringing him? What was the intent? And apparently, whatever it was could sound just like his son, because I'm sure that the father would have known if it wasn't his son. So yeah, that's really creepy. God only knows what would have happened to this poor man had he followed it all the way in. So that's a good example of how the fairies use tricks. They use tricks to lure people into, I guess dangerous situations. And these are just the cases, again, that we can trace back because they live to tell the tale. So it's interesting that little people can claim a marsh, a hill, heather. Do they own the forest? Are they the people of the forest? Well, more importantly, I guess the question is, is it just illusion that they use, or can they control the forest that will, like a limb? Can they transform the shape of the forest to catch their prey? Do they lure us into another dimension? If so, for what purpose? They often call these fairies little tricksters. They're mischievous. And it makes sense. It's like they play with the people in the forest. They confuse them. They lure them. They somehow skew time. That we know from other stories. They've been blamed for the deaths of some people, and yet I've heard stories where they save people. Like there was one such a case involved a 77-year-old woman who was lost in the forest for 11 days. They had a search crew from the community looking for her day in, day out, and they would actually leave these oranges on the ground with the purpose to, if the lady found the oranges, she could follow them home. And at worst case scenario, at least it was something there for her to eat, should she come across it. But, when they eventually did find the old lady, she said that the little people of the forest protected her and they fed her the oranges. And when they found her, she was actually far deeper in the woods than anyone had gotten with the oranges. So, she didn't find the oranges. Someone brought them to her. So why would the fairies help this old lady and attempt to kill some kid's father? It's really hard to see where the fairies lie. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they just so random and mysterious? It's hard to say for sure. But, for sure they like to confuse and play with people. And they seem to have some kind of control of the forest and possibly time and or dimensions. Now,
Well, and that brings up a good point. There's there's a lot of talk about the morality of the fairies, and while there do seem to be I guess in the stories and the mythologies, there's the certain distinctions made between good fairies and bad fairies, and I guess neutral fairies, and at the same time there's bad fairies that will do good things, for they're given a little bit of respect or a gift or something, and they react with unexpected kindness, and likewise good fairies who are insulted by some small slight or slip of the tongue or perceived slight, and go on the attack, as it were. And is an interesting topic to kind of underline that kind of mercurial nature of the fairy, that it seems to be, or they seem to have, I guess, a slightly different take on morality than what humans would kind of think. Oh, well, this guy's a good guy, and he's generally going to do nice things for people, and he's not going to lash out at somebody and take away their sight just because they didn't say good day, or didn't offer some bread or something like that. But with the fairy, there seems to be this very wide, uh, um, like the door is wide open for them to really. They're just really chaotic. Like I said, you could meet a bad one and it would do something nice for you. Meet a nice one that does something bad to you, and every other thing in between. And like you were talking about time and people disappearing and areas where the fairies live. And I find that a very interesting topic, specifically because a lot of the stories talk about fairies living in fairyland, their own dimension, as it were. It's really close by and seems to be accessible from here. And fairies can come here and we can go to fairyland. And some of the research I did seemed to indicate that there are certain cycles and certain times of the year. There's certain cycles that take, days, weeks, months, years. And sometimes the cycles basically are times where the barriers between the human world and the fairy world are, the barriers are weak or completely non-existent. And I believe there's the two that I came across were, it was like May 1st and February 1st or something like that. And apparently on those days, the barrier completely comes down, and or maybe it was November 1st. In either case, it was the what their version of in that time of Halloween, I guess they call Samhain, and the fairies absolutely love that time. Whereas I think May 1st was a celebration of life. And I guess it goes back to this strong inclination to believe that fairies are somehow attached to the dead, that, they don't like. It's not that the sun hurts them, but, there are certain things that are connected with festivals of life and rebirth that, the fairies don't like necessarily. And then there's, talking about what is fairyland, when people disappear into these forests and then they walk into a circle of mushrooms and aren't seen for 7 years. And they're like, oh, I've only been gone for 7 days. Um, or they've been gone for a day and it seems like a month. There doesn't seem to be any exact pattern to it. Like a day is a month, or a month in fairyland is a year in real world. That this change in the flow of time seems to be as chaotic as the fairies' behavior themselves.
Yeah, I mean that is the main point to underline is the chaotic nature, the inconsistency.
Yes.
And like some communities, or I should say cultures, have tried to, I mean, what do we do when we have these these things? We try to nail it down and make sense of it. So I've heard of some like Indian tribes who have they had different names for good fairies and bad fairies, right? I mean, there was a certain kind of good kind and a bad. I can't remember the names now, but they were able to, or I should say, they tried to separate them into their own category. But I mean, that's just like saying, there's good people and bad people, but we're not a different species of people. We're all people. But you know what I mean? Like the way that they would say it is almost like it was a different species of a fairy, right? And again, that's trying to make sense of it in a way that makes sense to us. But there's nothing about that makes any real sense to us. I mean, it's just like time, like when we think of time, it has a beginning, it has an end. A minute is a minute anywhere, an hour is an hour anywhere. But everything about these fairies, whether they're doing good things, bad things, whether you're disappearing into their dimension or whatever it is. I mean, it so varies so widely that it's really hard to put in there. But one thing I do think of, again, coming back to the whole tie into demons and stuff like that, it kind of reminds me of a Ouija board. Like the spirit you get on the other end can be really nice at first and then really bad. But apparently that's just the way the demons are anyway. They play with you. That's the thing. I mean, even if they seem like they're nice, there is usually an ulterior motive, right?
Yeah.
So, and again, I'm not saying that fairies are demons. I'm just making that parallelism. Now, before we go further, the next half of this episode is going to be really, really going to do some really unconventional stories and tie it to some, we're going to go into the angels and the demons. We're going to go into the fairy lights and the missing time some more. We're going to go into some really peculiar stories, and we're going to talk about changelings. So all of this stuff is not really well known. So this will be in part 2. If you want to catch that out or catch that, and so this is the end of part 1.